Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Goldster Inside Story. I am thrilled today, for more than one reason, to welcome the author Gerald Dickens, the author of this really good book. Oh, I haven't got it in the right place. Dickens and Staplehurst, a biography of a rail crash. Now, I'm very pleased because I love this book. And also, Gerald, as you may have noticed by the surname, is one of my extended family members. We are, in fact, second cousins once removed. I believe that's right, isn't it, Gerald?
I think it is. I think that's where we tied it down to now. Yeah.
I think basically there's a lot of us, and so I just usually end up saying cousin.
Cousin. Yeah.
That's a huge number of Dickens cousins. But this is not nepotism. This is a really good book. And I can't wait to talk to Gerald about it, especially as my voice seems to be going slightly. So, Gerald, welcome to Goldster. It's so good to have you here. Tell us, first of all, what happened on the 9th of June, 1865?
On the 9th of June, 1865. Well, in a little town in the heart of the county of Kent, a little town called Staplehurst, just outside, a train derailed from a bridge, fell into a river, and there were disastrous circumstances. 10 people killed, many people injured. But one of the passengers on the train happens to be Charles Dickens. And it was a day that was unbelievably important and had a major effect on his life for the remainder of the last 5 years of his life. So June the 9th, 1865 was an awful day in the Dickens family, but opened an awful lot of little avenues about which nobody knew at the time. So yeah, an important day.
And what actually happened? What led to this train crash? Explain to those who don't know about what traveling back from France to London was like.
It was a fascinating set of circumstances, and like any accident, like any disaster, it should never have happened. The railway system in Britain was in its infancy, but it was well regulated. There were plenty of regulations in place to keep the passengers safe. So what happened on that particular day? Dickens was traveling back from Paris to London, which meant boarding a cross-channel steamer at Boulogne, sailing across the English Channel to Folkestone. And there at Folkestone, there was a train waiting. It was the Blue Ribbon service for the South Eastern Railway Company. So that there was to be no delay. People got off the steamer, got onto the train, and immediately set off for London. Now, because of the tides in the Channel, that meant the train, the Tidal Express, left at a different time every day. The timing between the 9th of June and the 10th of June, for instance, was a 2-hour difference. Wow. So the timetables were drawn up for the whole network of the South East Railway to allow for the Tidal Express to steam its way right the way through up to London. Now, the problem was, on that particular day, June the 9th, there was a series of works going on the line. Nothing changes. There are always roadworks, and they didn't have a replacement bus service on that day. And just outside Staplehurst, there's a small river, very small river, called the River Bute, and it meanders backwards and forwards across very flat pasture and agricultural land, meaning that there were 3 separate viaducts across the river. So whilst the rail line went absolutely straight, the river meandered around underneath it. And over the past 10 weeks, all of the timbers on each of those viaducts had been replaced. They'd become rotten over the years, and there was a systematic process in which stretches of line were removed, timbers were removed, the line was replaced, and then they moved on to the next section. And on June the 9th, the working crew were onto the very last day of their work. They're on the last viaduct outside Staplehurst, and everything had gone well. There had been no incidences through the 10 weeks of work. It had all passed very safely. Everybody was confident with what they were doing. Probably had become a little blasé and over-relaxed coming to the end of the work. Now, I mentioned all of the fail-safes, all of the regulations that should have been in place. The first one was how the work was categorized. It had been going on for 10 weeks. The work should have been categorized as what was called a protracted repair, in that the line was going to be affected for a long period of time. Now, if that had been the case, the work would have to be inspected regularly by the director of the permanent way, a man called Joseph Gallimore. He would have to come down and look at the work and check everything was being done according to process. Also, there would have been bulletins posted regularly, so the drivers of the trains would know that this work was taking place. It wasn't categorized as a protracted repair. Gallimore, I think, didn't want the responsibility of having to go to Kent all the time, so instead he called it just a series of individual, very small repairs. Each stretch of line took 45 minutes. So you know, that's how he got around that. So it wasn't categorized as a protracted repair. That was the first thing that was ignored. The second thing was obviously the working crew needed to know when there was due to be a train coming if they were taking the rail up over a bridge over a river. That seems quite obvious. Now, most of the time that was fine because the trains were regular. The local trains came at the same time every day, and the work could be arranged around that. Just 45 minutes taking the line up, it could be put back down, the train through, you carried on working. But because of the tidal train, which came through at a different time every day, they had to work very carefully with the complicated timetables, which showed what time the train was coming. So in the morning of every day, the director of the plate layers, or the manager of the plate layers, a man called Henry Benge, consulted his timetable to check when the tidal express was due. And he was supposed to do this alongside the director of the carpenters, who also had a copy of the timetable, so they could check it together. And make sure they agreed. Now, on that day, 9th of June, 1865, the carpenter didn't have a copy of the timetable because, would you believe, it had been run over by a train the day before and cut in half. So he couldn't do that. So there was just one copy of the timetable that Benge studied. Now, he was barely literate, and he read the wrong page. He read the wrong page of the timetable. He was looking at the timetable for June the 10th. And on that day, the train was due to come through at just after 5 p.m., 5 o'clock in the afternoon. On June 9th, the timetable he didn't read, the train was due at 3 p.m., 2 whole hours earlier. So that was the second failsafe that was ignored or not properly proceeded. Even then, there were more. Whenever there was a breach in the line, whenever there was a gap, especially over a river, a member of the working crew was sent 1,000 yards up the line with a red flag. Now, 1,000 yards would give a train driver time to react, see the red flag, shut off steam, put on the brakes, and bring a train to a halt. The top speed of the train at that time was 50 miles an hour. The brakes were next to useless, but 1,000 yards would give him time to bring a train to stop from 50 miles an hour. So one of the workers was selected, given the red flag, and was sent to walk 1,000 yards up the line. But he didn't know what 1,000 yards was. He reckoned probably the telegraph poles along the side of the track were placed at about 100 yards apart. So he thought, if I count 10 of those, that's probably going to be about right. So he counted 10 of those, which took him about 400 yards up the line, or 500 yards up the line, you know, half the distance it should have been. It was woefully inadequate for that point of view. So he was in the wrong place. He was half the distance he should have been with his red flag. Even more, he should have been carrying fog charges with him, explosive charges, 2 of which were placed within sort of 50 yards of where he was standing, and then at regular intervals right up to where the gap in the line. Now, what would have happened with those was, as the train went by, the charges would detonate, thereby alerting the driver and the guards on the train that there was some sort of danger, and they could react absolutely instantly. Actually, it wouldn't have been soon enough, but still. He wasn't given the charges. He was given 2 charges instead of 10, and he was told to only place them if it was foggy. And it was a bright, clear, beautiful June day, like it is today. So all these different little things, any one of which could have prevented the accident, were ignored. And that's how everything happened. The train left Folkestone bang on time. It was steaming through the countryside, doing 50 miles an hour. It came through the previous station at Headcorn, absolutely top speed, bang on time. The signals at Headcorn station were set to all clear. Now, that is something I just don't understand. And the train just straight off the bridge, and disaster ensued. In fact, the train itself, the locomotive, still had so much speed and energy behind it. By the time it got to the gap in the rails over the bridge, it actually jumped the gap. It was sort of Evel Knievel like. The locomotive and the tender and the guards van and the first of the first class carriages cleared the whole gap, slewed around and were crossing the track, and the first class carriage was still attached by its couplings but was hanging down off the bridge. But after that, every single carriage just went straight down into the river, and each one crushing the one underneath. And that heavy raw iron engineering of the Victorian era, just crushing these little fragile matchwood carriages, it was an absolute disaster.
We've got a question here asking how many carriages were being hauled.
There were 11 carriages, 2 guards vans, and about 110 passengers on board.
Yeah. And the carriage that Charles Dickens was on, tell us about that and who Dickens was with.
Well, that was the carriage that was left hanging. It was caught in the wreckage of the bridge, and the couplings to the guards van ahead of it were still intact, and it was dangling down. So Dickens and his traveling companions were flung down into the corner of the carriage, upside down. The companions, he was traveling with two ladies, as he said, a young one and an older lady. The young lady was his mistress, Ellen Ternan. They had been in France together for a few months, and she was traveling with her mother, Frances, the 3 of them in the carriage. And
Ellen Ternan were actresses.
Yes, yes. Frances Ternan had been an actress for a long time and had formed a career in providing a sort of ready-made female troupe to take roles. Of course, the social standing of an actress in Victorian England was not terribly high. So if she could come in with her talented daughters, there were 3 daughters and Frances herself, that they could just be perfect for any performance that anybody wanted. So they're all, yeah, they're very talented actors. And that's how they first met. Dickens had employed the Ternan troupe to perform in a piece he was acting for a charitable performance in Manchester. He'd already done this show, The Frozen Deep, in London in his own house, but now he was going into a much larger theatre and didn't feel that the members of his family who had been involved in the original performance would be up to performing in such a large venue. So he engaged the Ternans to come and perform for him, and that's where he first met Ellen and the whole family.
And then that, of course, led to the end of Charles and Catherine Dickens's marriage.
Yeah,
his relationship with Ellen had to be kept very secret, didn't it?
Absolutely.
So what happened when they were in this highly written about train crash together? Did he manage to get away with it?
Well, initially yes. It's extraordinary. In researching the book, I was looking at all of the newspaper reports from the time, regional and national. And the journalists were getting names and getting stories about everybody that was involved, and their backgrounds and where they were traveling from and who they were going to meet and all these things in great detail. There's one name that's never mentioned, and that's Ternan. It's extraordinary. How he did. Dickens and Ellen had been remarkable at keeping their relationship secret, and would continue to do so. It was absolutely remarkable. Now, in a letter that Charles Dickens wrote just after the crash to a friend, he laid out the whole circumstances of the day and said, I was traveling with the 2 ladies. And at that point, he mentions that immediately after the crash, he opened the door and saw one of the guards running along by the side of the track. And he shouted to him, do you recognize me? Do you know who I am? And yes, of course we do, Mr. Dickens. Well, please open this door, unlock this door for me, bring a ladder here so I can empty this carriage, and then I'll assist in the rescue. And that's the moment that Ellen and Frances managed to drift away, disappear into the night. We next hear of them in London when Ellen is recovering from a broken arm that she suffered in the accident, and Dickens writes to his manservant in London asking him to take her food and baskets and flowers to make her cheerful and all of this. But actually on the day, just slipped away. Not a word was heard about that, which is extraordinary.
And actually, I mean, you describe it very well in the book, and you just mentioned them being hurled across the carriage into the
Mm.
corner. It is astonishing that none of them were killed. I mean,
Yeah,
the violence of that
yeah,
action of the train, phenomenal, really, that she escaped with a broken arm.
absolutely. And if the coupling hadn't held onto their carriage, then they would have been killed, because they would have been the bottom carriage in the river, with all of the rest of them just coming straight down, without a doubt. They were so lucky to survive.
And what was your favorite moment in the research? Was there something that you discovered that you'd never heard about before? Is there anything that really springs to mind?
Um, it was a fascinating process, because I sort of came to it from the wrong way, really. I started wanting to know more about this because, as an actor, as a performer, one of the pieces I perform is Dickens's ghost story, The Signalman, which was written just about a year after, which is about a haunted, tormented piece of railway line in a deep, dark, depressing cutting, and the signalman is seeing ghostly visions which are a portent to doom. So when I perform The Signalman, I always start with a little bit of talk about the circumstances of Staplehurst and how that almost certainly inspired Dickens's writing of that piece, to try and sort of exorcise himself of these memories of disaster on the railway line. And my introduction was always rather Wikipedia based, and it's interesting, actually. The train crash at Staplehurst never features very much in any of the big biographies of Dickens. It's always there because this is the first glimpse we get of Ellen in public, really, but it's normally quite quickly passed over. So I wanted to know a little bit more. I wanted to know sort of nerdy things, like what was the locomotive like? What type of locomotive was it? What time did the train leave? What boat did they come across the channel in? What was the weather like? What time had they started? Where were they staying? And all these little things of detail. So that's sort of where I started. And the first real thing that excited me very much was reading the Board of Trade report into the accident, and reading for the very first time names of people involved, not Charles Dickens and Ellen Ternan, but the 10 victims who lost their lives at Staplehurst, the driver of the train, the fireman, the leader of the plate layers, Henry Bench. And suddenly there were all these other names that made the story much more fascinating, much more interesting. And that's when I decided that this was going to be more than just an extended introduction to my show, but I wanted to get it all down in a book. I've never written a book before. Absolutely terrified at the prospect, and had no idea how to go about it. So yeah, that was the first exciting moment, is seeing the reviews. And then after that, just those little gems. You find something in a census somewhere, and suddenly lights go on, and you think, this is so exciting. And then you didn't even know you were looking for that bit of
Oh,
information.
yes. Rabbit holes it can take you down, where you suddenly start thinking, oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and you didn't know you were looking for it.
Yes.
That's what I love. There's one of the victims' husbands of the crash was very severely injured and recuperated in Staplehurst, and he was looked after by the schoolmistress and her sister. And I was looking him up in the census reports, and I discovered a year after he married the schoolmistress's sister. It was lovely. He came back to Staplehurst,
Yeah.
and married her, and then they all moved back to Liverpool, where he had a hotel and lived there. So these little things, and finding out the background to people's lives who I've never heard of up to that point.
Well, that's something I really loved about this book, the way you didn't just focus on Dickens, you gave a voice and a personality to people who would otherwise have been completely forgotten. And as we hear so frequently today, we want to know the names, not just of the celebrities, but of the real people. Tell us about some of those stories. When you just told us that really charming one about the Liverpool hotel owner, but tell us about some of the people you discovered.
Well, the very sad one was a French chef, a young French chef, Monsieur Mercier. And he'd been in France, and he was traveling back as everyone to London. Now, he worked for a a British admiral in Plymouth, at the dockyards in Plymouth, as a French chef. But he'd decided to spend a little more time in London with some friends of his first, and he'd written ahead to say, I will look forward to seeing you in London, and this is the time the train arrives, and I'll meet you at Charing Cross Station. And he settled into a carriage at Folkestone alongside a young gentleman called Edward Dickinson, who was the young man who was going to have a future in the army. They didn't know each other. They were just in the same compartment. And they passed a time of day probably, and they discussed the goings on in the newspapers, and they both took their seats, one on each side. And as the train came through Headcorn, so the station before Staplehurst, it was going along at 50 miles an hour, and Monsieur Messier decided that the wind coming through the window was disagreeable to him. He didn't like it. And he very politely sort of said to Mr. Dickinson, would you mind if we swap seats? Would that be all right? And Edward Dickinson said, yes, of course, that's fine. So they got up and they turned around and they changed seats. And 3 minutes later, the accident happened. And Mercier was killed and Dickinson survived. It was one of those absolute moments of sort of awful providence or coincidence or whatever. And I find that so sad. Now, Dickinson was actually one of the passengers that was pulled from the wreckage by Charles Dickens, and they became friends. Dickinson spent a Christmas at Gad's Hill with the family, and Dickens helped him in his career to a certain extent. So there are those moments that are terribly sad. There's a splendid lady who I want to do a second edition because I need to research some of these people more. Charlotte Faithfull. She was married to a judge in India, but she was obviously incredibly wonderful lady in her own right, and she was coming back from traveling on her own in Egypt and in the Far East, and she was looking forward to meeting up with her husband when he came back from India. She was another victim. There was get his name now. I need to check my.
That it's not just me who does this.
Oh, thank you. That's why I listed them all in the middle. Amelia Rayner. Very, very sad. She was traveling back with her little son, Lloyd Rayner Jr., and that they'd been away in France and were coming back to meet up again with husband Lloyd, and I think he was the one in Liverpool, and she was killed in the crash, and the little boy was taken off to Staplehurst Manor, a large house, and looked after there until he was well again and could be reunited with his father. There were all these little stories. Caroline White, I think it was coming back to be married, big society wedding. She was, people had noticed her on the quayside at Folkestone as being this remarkably handsome, beautifully dressed lady, and then she was coming back to be married. She was another victim. Annie Boddenham was a young bride doing a honeymoon tour with her husband, who was a solicitor in Hereford. She was killed in the accident. He was very badly injured as well. So all these little snapshots of moments in life of the people. Who was the not James Dunn, Adam Hampson. He was a surgeon from Bolton, and he and his wife had just seen an advertisement in the newspaper in London, come and do a sightseeing trip to Paris. So they got on a train to do a special sightseeing trip, and they come back from that. All these little stories.
Well, I'm going to ask you, because you mentioned briefly earlier, and we're going to talk about this a bit later, that you are actually an actor.
Yeah.
You perform, and so would you like to give a little reading to give us a flavour of the book, and a flavour, of course, of Gerald the actor?
Doing what he really does. Well, this is sort of the prologue from the book. So we sort of talked about it a little bit, but this is how the book begins. The June day was a hot one, and the early summer sun shone brightly from a clear blue sky. On the footplate of locomotive number 199, nothing seemed to be amiss. The express tidal train was maintaining a steady 50 miles per hour as it rushed across the Kentish countryside towards London. The hand on the regulator lever was that of George Crombie, a man of great experience with the South Eastern Railway Company and a careful driver. There was little for him to do, for the track was straight and flat, and his view ahead was clear, although slightly hindered by the low afternoon sun to his left. With him in the cab was his fireman, William Beattie, who, apart from shoveling coal into the roaring furnace, was also keeping a professional watch on the water gauges in order to ensure that there was always a constant pressure at the boiler. Elsewhere on the train, other employees of the railway company maintained their lonely vigils in their dark guards vans with no duties to occupy their time. Behind the locomotive, there were 11 passenger carriages, and these were filled by a cast of characters, most of whom had risen early in Paris that morning in order to join the train to Boulogne, where they would board the steamer Victoria to Folkestone. The regular cross-channel service was a popular one, and the service on June the 9th had around 110 passengers, all bound for London. There were businessmen travelling alone. There were mothers with children returning from a trip to rejoin the rest of their families. There were elderly couples who had taken the opportunity of joining a sightseeing excursion to Paris. There was a French chef returning to Plymouth, where he was in the employ of a British admiral, although he had allowed himself a few days in London to meet up with his friends before heading west. In the first of the first-class carriages sat a gentleman and two ladies, each lost in their own thoughts. The gentleman studied a sheaf of handwritten papers, and occasionally a smile, maybe a chuckle, broke his lips. His bright eyes shone with great intensity. He was accompanied by two ladies, a younger one of 26 who sat next to him, and her mother sitting opposite. There was an intensity to them too, although at that moment they were not in the same world as their companion. The man was Charles Dickens, and he travelled with his mistress Ellen Ternan and her mother Frances. At Headcorn Station, the buildings flashed by in a rush, and perhaps some of the children on the train gasped in shock at the sudden change in noise and light. Their parents held them close, laughed, and reassured them. Everything was perfectly all right. They were quite safe. The uninformed assumption from the carriages was officially confirmed on the footplate, for Crombie noticed that the signals were set to all clear and the train sped on. And then it happened. A whistle, two whistles, a lurching as brakes were applied, a huge noise as the great driving wheels were reversed. The carriages shuddered. Charles Dickens, Ellen, and Frances were flung from their seats into the corner of their compartment. A moment before, everything had been ordered and clear, and now all was confusion. The wall became the roof, and the roof became the wall. Ellen lay at the bottom of the human heap with her arm twisted to an unnatural angle, and she cried out to Dickens to hold her hand. For a moment, all was quiet. And then the screaming began. It was 3:20 p.m. on Friday the 9th of June, 1865, and the remains of the tidal train lay shattered in the River Bult near to the Wealden town of Staplehurst. This is the story of how Charles Dickens, Ellen Ternan, and the rest of the passengers came to be involved in one of the most serious rail disasters of the day. In the following pages, I will explain how Charles Dickens had risen to become one of the greater celebrities of the Victorian era, and how he came to be travelling on the ill-fated train with Ellen and Frances Ternan. I will show how a routine repair to the railway line led to disaster, and the overlooking of numerous fail-safes demanded by the regulations exacerbated the situation. I will describe the terror at the scene of the crash and Charles Dickens's involvement in the rescue of his fellow passengers, as well as his own suffering in the days, weeks, and years following the accident. At its heart, this is a story of a single moment in time, a biography of a day. And there we are. That leads us.
Thank you very much. Oh, there's a little bit more to this, isn't there? Because then I seem to believe that you risked life and limb to research this book. Tell us about that story, your Vicar of Dibley moment.
Oh my word! Yeah, I'd say you couldn't write it, but I did. I decided I was performing one of my shows in Ashford, a beautiful art centre in Ashford, where I perform quite regularly. And Ashford is the nearest large town to Staplehurst. So as I was just embarking on the writing of the book, I thought I would take myself to the site of the crash, just to experience it, just to get the lie of the land, if you like. I had been there before, but a long time previously. I took 10 red roses with me. I was going to lay them on the embankment of the railway line in honor of the 10 victims. It was a lovely day. It was, I think, November. It was quite clear, but it had been raining very heavily over the previous weeks. So I parked my car and I found the gate into the field, which would take me up to where the bridge was. And across the gate, there were chains and there were padlocks and there were signs saying, keep out and prosecution will follow and don't dare come. So I did what my father would have been very proud of me for doing, and ignored them all and climbed over the gate and walked into the field and followed the line of the railway line until it met the River Bult as it goes under, and there's still a bridge there, and the line is still in action. So I was there. I was near to the scene of the crash. Now Dickens mentioned in his description there was a little copse of trees nearby where a number of the victims were laid out, and so I wanted to get closer to that scene. So I stepped forward a little bit into a puddle just to get there, and as I stepped forward, I felt my foot just give way down the muddy bank. And I sort of went down and down and down until literally the water was up to my neck. Now, I did what any self-respected person would do, and I held my phone and my camera high. Absolute priorities, look after the technology. And I could just feel the bank going underneath me. And here I was in the middle of a field where I shouldn't have been, where I was trespassing. There wasn't anyone else for miles. I managed to grab hold of some roots and some trees. And they gave way again, so I was going further under, and at last I managed to get my foot on some sort of ground and hauled myself out. I was just dripping, squelching around. But interestingly enough, being there in the River Bult for that moment just suddenly brought the whole thing very, very gave it a great sense of reality. Suddenly I realized how terrifying, this was me slipping on a muddy bank in my Wellington boots. I mean, that's not exactly disastrous, but I know how scared I felt. And the thought of that train coming along the embankment and then crashing down, and people being flung through windows into the river as well. Funnily enough, most of the people that survived were thrown clear of the wreckage. Very few people drowned. It was so I hauled myself out. And I laid the 10 flowers and sort of had a moment to reflect, and then squelched my way across the field again. And then the farmer appeared. And he sort of looked at me and didn't say anything. I've got to brazen this out. So I said, good morning. I've just been up to the scene of the rail crash. I wanted to lay some flowers. Didn't say who I was or anything. I just wanted to lay some flowers. And he looked at me, this rather wet apparition in front of him, and he just said 2 words, and those 2 words were Charles Dickens. It's extraordinary, here in a wet field. So that was the beginning of my research, and it was rather more intense than I'd perhaps planned upon. And the final thing, I didn't have any other clothes with me, so I drove to a nearby supermarket in Ashford, and I squelched around the shop, and I sort of picked things up, and I was standing in the queue at the till, dripping on the floor, and God bless the English, nobody said a thing. I love it.
I was thinking, I hope there was somewhere that you could have a shower before you.
I know. Well, then I got to my hotel and I could do all that. But what a day. Yeah.
So you talked about, we were joking about it, but you talked about that moment that you felt very close, and I was wondering, because Dickens is your great grandfather, did you feel very connected to him when you were writing the book or researching the book?
Funny enough, as it went on, less so. I wanted to know everybody else's stories. I wanted to know the more overall picture. It's an interesting point, but the Dickens side of the story I knew pretty well already, so I wasn't on a sort of voyage of discovery on that one. It's interesting. Where I feel closer to Charles Dickens is when I'm performing. That's the connection I can feel. It didn't so much happen with the writing of this book.
Because Dickens was, as people may not be aware, a very consummate actor. He could have been a professional actor, and he wanted to be. That gene came down very strongly in you. Didn't come to me.
Well, it's come down through quite a few in the family, actually. And the gene that has come down in all of us is communication. We all approach it in different ways. There are writers, and there are people in marketing and PR and journalists and actors, and we all have that gene. I think.
So tell us about your acting career. When did you know that you wanted to be an actor?
I knew I wanted to be an actor when I was 9 years old, and I was cast as an oversized cockerel in a school nativity play. Um, I that's the story that's far too long to go into here. But like so many actors, I was incredibly shy and insecure, and didn't like socializing or being with people. And yet suddenly I discovered that I could be well, in that case, something else. And people sat and listened and laughed and clapped, and this was amazing. Just for a little brief bit of time, I can be someone else. Not that I didn't like being who I was, but I like the opportunity to be other people as well. So that's when it started, at the age of 9. And from that moment, I always got myself involved in whatever theatrical production I could find, whether it's a school production or amateur dramatics or semi-professional or corporate theatre later, or all that sort of thing. Just to be part of this amazing world. So that was always a thing. Now, for a long time, the works of Charles Dickens had no effect on me at all. I'd had Oliver Twist as a set text to my O-level and absolutely hated it. Just really the only emotion I had about it was guilt for inflicting it on all my classmates, and they never stopped letting me know that. So the works of Dickens didn't affect me for a long time. I was very aware of him because my father, as with your father, was a massive fan and a massive scholar, and was also always writing articles and giving speeches. So the house was full of Dickensiana, but didn't mean anything to me until 1980, when the Royal Shakespeare Company performed their version of Nicholas Nickleby. And we as a family were taken to see it on New Year's Eve, presumably because anyone with any sense was out doing something else on New Year's Eve, so they had an empty theatre and they wanted to fill it. So the Dickens family were invited to go along.
Wasn't it 6 hours long or something?
Yeah, it was 8 hours. 8 hours long. It was stunning. And I didn't want to be there. New Year's Eve, 18-year-old, I didn't want to be watching 8 hours of Dickens. As soon as it started, I was absolutely hooked because it was so theatrical and it was so exciting and it was so funny and it was so tragic, and the villains were villainous, and Nicholas and Smike together, and the Crummels Theatre Company. Good grief, I'd met all those people so many times before. And suddenly Dickens meant something to me. That was the moment. That was the moment. New Year's Eve, 1980. I'll never forget it. And from that moment, I started reading the works of Charles Dickens in a completely different way, almost as theatre scripts. And then in 1993, I was asked to do a reading of A Christmas Carol to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the publication of the book. And again, as a performer, I just had such fun doing it because all these characters are just there. They come alive. You can't help read his words without turning into the character. And Scrooge, he was a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. I mean, you get to the end of the sentence and you're him. You can't help it. It's brilliant. And that's where it all started. And then the first show based on a book that wasn't A Christmas Carol was Nickleby, because that had such an influence on me. And I've been doing that ever since. 30 years this year, performing the works of Charles Dickens. I know.
And you do lots of different work. You do the Signal, which you talked about before. You do Dr. Marigold. Just so tell us, what are the differences? Because you said this is the first book you've written. I hope it's not the last book, because I think it's really good. And I'd love you to do a second edition and add.
Yes, I would. I know.
I was able to do that with Katie, my biography of Dickens's daughter.
Right. Yeah.
Touch with me and said, "Oh, now I know who painted Great Aunt so and so," and his. So I was able to add things in, and I have to say, as a writer, it's so fantastic to be able to expand on a book you've already written. So, but
and not having any experience before, it's a fascinating discipline as to know when to stop. You've got to publish this thing sometime.
Exactly.
And yet the stuff keeps rolling in.
I hate to tell you that research fervor just never goes, and you'll just keep discovering.
Good.
All the people I've written about, I just one day I'll update that book and do this.
Actually, the best bit of research for this book was being allowed to drive a steam train at our local heritage rail site. That was great.
And that I am extremely envious of. I wish I'd thought to write this book now. What are the differences between writing a book and writing for the stage? Because you've written a lot of your own compositions for the stage.
Yes, I do. What is the difference? The voice, I think, in that when I'm writing for the stage, I'm trying to think of how it will sound. So what voices I can use to create a character, and also it's much more of a practical process. So take Nickleby. When I was writing my version of that, there are certain scenes I wanted. I had to have the Cromwell's Theatre Company. Of course I did. Well, how did I get Nicholas from London to Portsmouth, where the Cromwells were? So I needed to include a scene which allowed me to do that, which is the letter that Fanny Squeers wrote to Ralph Nickleby, which is brilliant in its own right. And then once they're down in Portsmouth, the Cromwell's Theatre, well, they've got to get back to London again because the plot happens back. So how do I get them back from there? So it's sort of, in a way, it's sort of quite a practical sense of just laying the pieces out and working out how they all work together. And so from that point, the story, the writing of the book was much more exciting for me as things presented themselves to me, as I discovered more. And I hoped that would be the same with the reader, that we would be on this sort of no, I'm not going to say journey. we would be in this together, sort of as the plot built up. I think I was less constrained with practicalities in the book. You could just take it where you wanted to go.
So, of course, one of the benefits of there being a famous person on board was that it probably got far more column inches in the newspapers. So you had that area to research.
Yeah.
But there's also a photograph. If you go to the Dickens Museum in London, anybody who's listening, if you go to the Charles Dickens Museum in London, which I thoroughly recommend,
Absolutely.
there's a photograph of the train crash. Tell us about that photograph.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. It's made up of 3 panels, and it was taken by a man called Frederick Watson. And Frederick Watson, he said, referring to page 128, he was just a villager in Staplehurst. I think he was a baker or something like that. But his fascination at the time was the science of photography, and that's how it was seen at the time. It was a science; it wasn't an art form. And he was dabbling with photography and had lots of huge equipment in his house in Staplehurst. He heard about the wreckage, gathered all his stuff, sort of lumbered out over the field, in the same way I'd gone, presumably, and set up his tripods and managed to expose 3 plates, which gives a panoramic view of the wreck. And in the middle is one carriage just stood up on the line, and I believe that was Dickens's carriage that had been lifted back onto the line, so quite a way after the accident itself. But that image was then used by a lot of the newspapers and magazines of the time to create very dramatic pictures of Dickens amidst a rescue, sort of hair swept back and sort of, almost as if there are huge cascading waves from the river, and nothing like that. But it's an amazing picture to see. It really does give a sense of the scene and the desolation, actually, because it's quite an empty photograph. And I do have it in the book, but I don't think it will show up very clearly on the
Not a very clear image anyway.
It's very small, but it's fascinating to see. But yes, it just happened to be someone there who had a fascination in photography. It wasn't any of the newspapers. You mentioned the point that because there was a famous person on board, it got a lot of coverage, and that certainly is, of course, true. But there was a whole series of rail accidents at that time, and like any awful, horrible disaster like mass shootings or anything like that, once there's one, the press latch on and they want to report every single one. So even the day before, even the day of the accident, actually, the newspapers were full of a report of another derailment and multiple deaths in an accident near Shrewsbury on the Great Western Railway. So rail accidents were being well reported anyway. At the time, horribly, gruesomely. It was that awful sort of rubbernecking thing that everybody wanted to know.
Yeah. So you are doing a performance, aren't you, at the Didcot Railway Centre? So this book has not put you off going by train. Tell us about the performance. I've put a link for those who are watching. There's a link in there. 20th of June at the Didcot Railway Centre. Tell us about the Didcot Railway Centre and what you're doing there.
The Dickens Railway Centre is wonderful. It's part of the Great Western Railway, and they have a huge railway shed where they work on restoration, and you can see these amazing. I think steam locomotives are just the most remarkable things out. And I was there earlier in the year with the book. That they had a sort of open fun day. So I was over the Easter weekend, so I took the book and were chatting. And I was walking around the site and found this big signal box overlooking the railway line, and just mentioned, wouldn't it be a great idea to do the signalman here? Actually buy a signal box, buy a stretch of railway line. And they took me up on it. They said, "Yeah, absolutely. Come back later in the year, do it. We'd love to do it, and we'll get a locomotive behind you with steam coming out of the chimney and everything." So yeah, that's coming up on the 20th, which is going to be very exciting. Sadly, it's not in a deep, dark, wet, dripping railway cutting, which would be even better, but it's going to be very atmospheric to be there. And the day I was there on Easter, they had a little locomotive from the mid 1800s, and the driver of it came up to me. It was making a guest appearance. It came from I can't remember where, Yorkshire or somewhere, but it had come down to make a guest appearance. And the driver came up and said, "There's a connection between you and this locomotive." Fascinating. And it was the locomotive that played the part of the Staplehurst train in the film of The Invisible Woman, with Ray Fiennes playing Dickens. And it was the only working steam locomotive of the right era. So that had starred as the Staplehurst locomotive.
Oh, and thankfully they didn't have to actually crash it.
No. So that was exciting. So, yeah.
So you spend a lot of your time performing. Tell us about your trips to America, because I believe you've got, is it 3 trips coming up this year?
Yeah, this year. I've been traveling to America since 1995, I think my first trip was, and I go back every single year, mainly performing A Christmas Carol. That's the time of year I'm there, from the end of November up to the Christmas season. And I just love traveling in America. I love performing in America. The American audiences are just so enthusiastic and so excited. And it's wonderful. I retired once, and the first Christmas that I didn't go, I thought, no, I can't bear it. I'm too much. So I unretired the next year very quickly. It's very exciting, and a lot of the places I go are places that Charles Dickens visited as well. So I can dip into his letters or into American notes and see what he was saying about a certain town or a certain city or river or railroad or whatever, and compare notes now. That's always fascinating.
Have you ever been to Cairo, Illinois?
No, I haven't yet.
I was in Chicago a few years ago giving a talk about Dickens, and Dickens wrote in American Notes, everybody, he wrote very rudely about Cairo, Illinois, which he wrote about sarcastically in Martin Chuzzlewit, naming it Eden in a very sarcastic fashion. And I was asked about 10 years ago to apologize to the people of Illinois, which I did unreservedly, obviously. I felt it was a bit sad that they hadn't forgiven him for what he wrote in 1842. But
yeah.
I thought I'm just going to apologize and move on.
Well, I had an apology offered to me. It was the other way around. I was traveling in Ohio, and went to a little town called Waynesville. And when Charles Dickens, on his first trip to America in 1842, was heading out to the Great Plains, he stopped in a town called Lebanon at a tavern, an inn called the Golden Lamb. And he'd been driving all day on a stagecoach and was parched, and it was dusty. And he went into the hotel and demanded a drink of brandy. And they said, "I'm sorry, sir, this is a temperance hotel, temperance house. We don't serve alcohol. We have water." So he stomped off down the road to another tavern and discovered that was temperance house as well. And the whole town was a temperance town. So he was very angry and got in his carriage and went off to the next little town, which was called Waynesville. Same problem. Nobody would give him any brandy, and this was all he wanted. And he went to a house and they didn't have any. And he stormed off and apparently sort of thumbed his nose at them as he left. So they invited me back a few years ago now, and everywhere I went, they poured brandy down me. It was great. It was so sorry. We want to repair the awful historical slight that we made to Charles Dickens. So here's a glass of brandy. And I was giving a show that night. Heaven knows how I didn't walk off the front of the stage. I was absolutely paralytic with the amount of brandy they gave me. So yeah.
So when Dickens, we talked a little bit earlier about Dickens, getting the guard to help get the Turnans out, and
Yeah.
then he said he would help, which he did. He was seen as something in the papers, wasn't he? As a bit of a hero. He
Yes, absolutely.
famously filled his hat with water and took it to people to drink and wash their wounds and things. So tell us what he did. You mentioned that he was looking at a sheaf of papers. What did he do once everybody was safe and out of the train?
Well, one of the reasons he was traveling back to London was he had the latest part of Our Mutual Friend. That was a novel he was working on at the time. And of course, he wrote all of his novels in either monthly or weekly installments. Our Mutual Friend was in monthly installments. So he had his handwritten manuscript that he was going to deliver to his publishers in London as soon as he arrived. So the crash happened. He was flung into the corner of the carriage. He rescued Ellen and Francis, got them. He then spent 2 to 3 hours in amongst the wreck, helping people. The first person he came across died in his arms. Another young lady he tried to help died as well. He pulled people out from the wreckage. About 3 hours he was there. And at the end of all that, he suddenly remembered that he had the manuscript still hanging in his coat in the carriage. So he clambered back into the wreck of the car to retrieve his manuscript. Incredible, I suppose, professionalism. And did take it to London and immediately went to his publishers and delivered the next part. And then that there was a small preface to the next part explaining that the various characters, the boffins, had been involved in this terrible accident with him, but everyone was all right. So yeah, so for all the time he spent among the dying and wounded, he still remembered that he had responsibilities as an author. And I suppose losing an entire monthly part would be the equivalent of a computer crashing and you haven't backed it up and you think, oh no, that was the best language I've ever written, and I've now completely forgotten what I said. So yeah, that was his action in the aftermath of it.
So we've got a question here. After the accident, did Dickens's religious views change?
I have no idea. Dickens and religion is a fascinating one, actually, because Charles Dickens never really trusted anything that was organized by the human hand, whether that was government or local parish or religion. But he did have an incredibly strong sense of faith and passed that on to his children very much. He wrote them a little book called The Life of Our Lord, which he gave to each of his children as they left home, in order that they might know of the teachings of Jesus Christ and live their lives by that. Whether he changed in the aftermath of the accident, I don't know. One of the best things I've learned in being a Dickens over the years is when to say, I don't know. It's very easy to try and to talk your way through it, and actually, that there are people who have much more expertise in those particular fields, and in this case, I'm going to hold my hand up and say I don't know.
I have never seen that he changed his religious views.
No, I don't think so.
He said he had a strong faith, but he didn't really trust the people who ran most religions.
Who ran it, yeah.
Tell us about the psychological effects on Dickens.
Well, it's now very much recognized and is quoted in many textbooks and papers and lectures that Dickens was suffering very much from PTSD. All of the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder are very obvious in his behavior in the weeks and months afterwards. There are two historical cases that modern lecturers in PTSD refer to. One is Dickens and the other is Samuel Pepys witnessing the Great Fire of London. When I was giving a performance of the Signalman locally in my hometown, a gentleman came up to me afterwards and said, wow, you describing how Charles Dickens felt after the accident and how he reacted absolutely chime with me, because I was in the Paddington rail crash at Ladbroke Grove, and I was on that train. I wasn't hurt, I wasn't injured, but everything you spoke about Dickens, he would be traveling through London, even in a hansom carriage or something, and if it just went over ruts in the road, he would suddenly grab hold of the seat and stare at the floor and sweat And his family would say it was as if he were back in that railway carriage again, reliving the scene. Now, he said it wasn't actually the accident itself that had the effect on him. It was what he witnessed during the rescue process. He wrote many letters in the days afterwards, and he said it wasn't the crash, it was what I saw during the rescue. And little by little, the symptoms of PTSD gradually subsided, as they do, until he received a letter from a friend of his saying, I've just been involved in a train derailment. It wasn't serious, nothing happened, but I just thought you'd like to know. And suddenly Dickens was back there again. And my friend who was involved in the Paddington crash said exactly that. You just never know when it's quite going to hit you. The slightest sound, just the slightest vibration, it just triggers something in the mind, and you're back there. And yeah, the last 5 years of his life, he was not in good health at all. He was engaged in extensive reading tours, and of course that meant traveling by train. That was the only way he could get from location to location up and down the country, from Scotland to Ireland, all across England and in America as well. So he was forced into train travel, and many a time he would get off a train and try and find a different way of continuing his journey because it was just too much for him.
Yeah. And I think it's absolutely no coincidence, is it, that he died on the 9th of June, the anniversary.
June, the exact anniversary of
Yeah.
the train crash. Yeah. And apparently that's quite common
Right.
in cases of PTSD. It's yeah.
Thank you, Gerald. It has been such a joy having you here today. Really, really lovely to see you, even if it's only on Zoom, and to share this
Yeah, exactly.
Dickens and Staplehurst biography of a rail crash. I thoroughly recommend it. It's not very big. It's very, very easy to read, and you've really brought out the people who needed to be brought out, the other people on board, not only Dickens, as well as being really fascinating about Dickens himself. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Lucinda. It's been a real pleasure. It's been great talking to you.
So for those of you who are around tomorrow, I shall be talking to the novelist, Amanda Craig. She's written a gorgeous new book, which is called The Three Graces. It's a really, really fun book, and I do hope that you'll come along and join me tomorrow. She's fascinating, and it's such a Goldster book. It's about 3 octogenarian friends and their lives in Tuscany and how they are just not giving it. In fact, there's one of them who says at one point, I want to have an adventure before dementia, and that just really made me laugh. Her writing is witty, it's poignant, it features lots of very important themes about modern life, and she's just a really fun person to talk to. So I do hope that you'll come along and join this. And just to say that next Tuesday, you've got Humphrey, who is doing a very special PPG from Riverside with Saliha Mahmood Ahmed, the chef. It's going to be really fascinating. She's written a book called Foodology. So do get ready for that next Tuesday. If you're not going along in person, please join online. Thank you for all your lovely comments here. So interesting, very enjoyable, loved it. Such an interesting interview, a must read. It sounds a gem of a book with many facets. Thank you. On that note, everybody, take care. I will hopefully see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.